Southern Gothic is a subgenre of Gothic fiction, which is a subgenre of romantic fiction. A few key differences that we find specific to Southern Gothic. First, it takes place in the American South. Our castle or mansion becomes the plantation house. We have very specific gender roles and a focus on decay, specifically a decay of moral values and old Southern values. There are several grotesque situations and other events relating to or coming from poverty, alienation, racism, crime, and violence. And we see that quite heavily in A Good Man is Hard to Find, as well as A Rose for Emily. William Faulkner published A Rose for Emily in 1930. It's basically the 1930s version of Fatal Attraction. So we have a few questions that we have to ask here. First, who is our narrator? One of the townspeople, but submerges his individual identity into the collective, meaning we have plural references 48 times. We know that our narrator has watched Emily for over 60 years. We also know that the narrator's not older because there's references to 90-year-old Confederate vets at the funeral as them and the very old men, and also not younger, referring to the rising generation. And this narrator, can we say is male? Note the disparaging remarks about women at the end of paragraph 3. Next, we have a concern regarding reliability. Is this narrator objective? Note the emotional biases, so attracted and repelled. Why does the narrator watch? Why is this narrator a voyeur? So, several questions about the narrator's reliability, but also who the narrator happens to be. Next, let's take a look at the symbolism we find in the house, and this is a typical Gothic convention. So we have the house attached to Emily, attached to the mind, and also representing the Old South. That is, it's a multiple symbol. So the house itself, it's, to throw out a few quotes from the story, is lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay. And the judge equates the smell of the house with the smell of Miss Emily later. And we also know that as Emily declines, the house is called once white and then becomes an eyesore. So Emily, once a virgin, becomes a fallen monument, in other words, a fallen woman. And remember that when we have descriptions of a house, that's usually associated with our character, the main character living in that house, similar to art parallelism that we find in our general conventions of Gothic. We do have a repeated intrusion and repeated violation, so the narrator is intrusive into Emily's life. And then in part 1, we have the invasion by the Board of Aldermen. Part 2, the invasion of the Lime Spreaders. Part 4, the Baptist minister and the visit from relatives. And then 5, when the horde comes to actually bury Emily. The house structure itself represents repression, kind of like Poe's Cask of Amontillado. So the house is full of dust, disuse, and darkness. We have the dim hall. It's obviously dark at night. The house is filled with dusk and shadows, and there's a lack of sunlight. And we can connect that directly to her unconscious. And the second floor, we have the locked room. There's the shrine, so Emily as an idol, a fallen monument, and we can also connect Emily as having a Peter Pan syndrome. So she refuses to submit to time and actually grow up. She won't accept post office numbers put on her house. She does not accept paying taxes. She won't admit that her dad is dead, and she won't let Homer leave and jilt her. And also the crayon portrait. Well, who uses crayons? Children use crayons. So a lot of direct references here to her immaturity, her inability to grow up. The father himself is our invisible character. Again, we have the crayon portrait. So we know that she's an accomplished teacher in art, yet she uses a crayon, again suggesting the childlike mentality. In other words, the father-daughter relationship has been arrested at an early age. Then there's the tableau. So there's white in the background, father in the foreground, father with his back to her, clutching a horsewhip, both framed by a back-flung door. And then we also have Homer coming into this, and Homer is like the father, whom she wouldn't admit died, so they both have the whip. She wants to keep both bodies. And note that profound is used to describe both Homer's skull and how she muses over her father's coffin. Therefore, what Faulkner suggests is that the cause of Emily's aberration is an unresolved Oedipal-Electra complex. So again, delving into Freudian psychology regarding her mental grotesque. Okay, let's take one very close look at our narrator, who has two opposite views of her. One is a derogatory view, as mentioned before, the fallen monument, and describing the house as an eyesore and stubborn and coquettish decay. And Emily is buried among the ranked and anonymous graves of Civil War soldiers, so there's a loss of social status there. Her body is described as fat and bloated early on. But then there's the positive side. Emily is seen in the chivalric tradition of the courtly love, so the focus on a noble lady, in other words, a lady lives in a castle at a distance. The narrator can't have the lady. The lady has a spiritual aura, so the idol in the window. And the lady has a sensuous and secret relationship. Baron's name suggests his nobility as a knight-errant, even pictured on horseback. And the narrator's obsessed with the lady's eyes. The narrator casts himself as the other lover in this kind of a courtly love tradition, so the poet. Perhaps the narrator, being in love with her, was one of the suitors that her father had chased away. And then we have to ask, why did the narrator tell this story? Is it revenge for being chased away? Is there a sense of social inferiority? So in other words, the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they thought they were? Or is it jealousy over Homer? Homer is a northerner who wooed and won her when the narrator failed to do so. Yet, he is a day laborer, so he's chewing tobacco, cussing a lot. He's not the southern gentleman. And again, the north kind of invading the south, those northern values taking over the old southern values, gets connected to this idea of southern Gothic and a decay of those southern values. And we must question Emily herself. Is there something very strange going on with her? Did the father know that Emily was not all there, that she was mentally disturbed, and that's why he chased everyone away? What kind of relationship did the two of them really have? So is there some kind of incestuous relationship going on here, as mentioned earlier regarding the Oedipal-Electra complex? And finally, something we need to ask is, what is going on with Toby, the butler? He stays through this entire story until the very end, when he basically disappears after letting the women in. So there are a lot of questions that we don't get answered, and a lot of characters that we don't see very clearly. So Faulkner leaves us with that and keeps it open to interpretation.